or rather, how about introducing yourself, Abira?
Hi, everyone. My name is Abira. I am an intern with USC Sea Grant this summer through the Wrigley Institute for the Environment and Sustainability from USC.
Awesome, thank you. Abira will be our tech master for today, so we're grateful she's on board. And just for everybody's awareness, we'll be recording today's session so that those that weren't able to attend can catch up after, and those that did attend can recap if that's helpful. So Abira, next slide, please. Okay, so before we get started, we want to do a quick land acknowledgement for the areas that we'll be discussing, the areas that a lot of us work and live in. The Southern California Bight is located on the unceded, sacred, and traditional lands of the Tongva, Ajashaman, and Chumash nations, the First Native peoples. They are the original stewards of this land, and they continue in this role today. Next slide, please. Okay, so today what we'll be doing is we'll give a brief intro, like I said, to AdaptLA, to the work that we're doing. We'll have that followed by a presentation by Karina Johnston on beach dune restoration for coastal resilience in Southern California. And then we'll have plenty of time for a Q&A session where you all can ask Karina questions directly. And then we'll follow that up at the end with some resources and some follow-up materials and how to move forward. Next slide, please. So some of you are familiar with the AdaptLA program. For those of you that aren't, we'll just give a quick overview. So the AdaptLA program is really a community of practice for the Los Angeles, Southern California region. And the goal of the program is to support planning for coastal impacts of climate change and to build climate resilience in communities. The way that we do that is by linking coastal jurisdictions and interested parties in the coast with the best available science to inform planning efforts. A way that we do that, for example, is through meetings and webinars like these, so that we can have opportunities to not only learn from each other, but from researchers, from other practitioners. Next slide, please. Okay, and so the reason that, or part of the reason that we have today's topic is because of some of the recent storms that we saw this past winter, all up and down the coast, but especially in Southern California. We saw a lot of damage to coastal infrastructure, a lot of threats. You can see here some physical infrastructure as well as some coastal access points that are threatened by climate change, storm surge, and all of those threats will be increasing with time. And so we really saw a pressing need for adaptation strategies. And so we're excited today to be able to talk about a case study of a strategy that was quite successful and provided multiple benefits. So without further ado, we'll get to introducing our speaker. Next slide, please. So today we have Karina Johnston. We're so excited. She is a PhD student and a USC Sea Grant trainee. Karina Johnston has been a passionate scientific and community leader in the Southern California region for many years, and she has extensive experience in developing, implementing, and directing scientific programs and projects that restore ecological function to coastal habitats. She's currently completing her PhD at the Bren School in partnership with the Marine Science Institute, conducting research relating to ecological and physical trajectories of beach restoration projects in Southern California. She evaluates beach and dune restoration projects for their potential to be nature-based adaptation strategies to help combat climate impacts such as sea level rise. Karina received her BS from UCSB and her master's from James Cook University. She's also a board-certified environmental scientist and is a certified ecological restoration practitioner. In 2021, she was elected to the board of directors for the American Shore and Beach Preservation Association. Karina, we're so happy to have you here today. I'll pass it off to you so that you can share your exciting work.
Thank you so much, Karina. Appreciate it. And I appreciate the opportunity to share some of this exciting coastal resilience work with this group. Thank you all for attending today. I'm just going to share my screen. This is the right screen, right, Karina?
Yep, okay. Looks good.
Thank you. So thank you for the introduction, Karina. I won't repeat all of that, but I am a current PhD student at UCSB and a USC Sea Grant trainee. And I also wanted to thank USC Sea Grant program for funding a portion of this research that I'll be talking about today. I'm also the senior restoration ecologist for Tidal Influence, a consulting group focused on the California coast restoration. Today, I'll be talking about dune restoration on urban beaches as a coastal resilience approach. I think a lot of the folks on the Zoom understand some of the motivation and need for this work. But just to give you a little example, this is a screenshot from the Our Coast, Our Future USGS storm flooding and hazard mapping program, and I could link to it in the chat after this as well. This is a map of the Marina del Rey and Venice Beach area, and this is a current flooding scenario. So today, with no sea level rise and without a storm, you can see some of the blue indicates some of the places that there is current water, and largely in Marina del Rey on the beach of Venice. If we flip forward in time to about 2100 and add in a 20-year storm event, we can see that the vulnerability of our coastline to flooding is extreme. We have projected substantial beach loss in up and down California, along with vulnerabilities associated with coastal infrastructure. And so the need for improving our resilience to coastal flooding and adaptation is high. These types of storm events and sea level rise flooding events are only going to increase with time. After a winter like we just had with substantial storm events, and going into next winter where there's a projected likely El Nino scenario, we have an even higher need to identify vulnerable locations and protect them with adaptation approaches. What I'm going to be focusing on today is the nature-based end of the adaptation spectrum. And you can see on this slide, the left-hand side has nature-based solutions and adaptation approaches, moving into hybrid approaches and more structure-based approaches like jetties, seawalls, revetments. And specifically today, I'll be giving you some examples from the Santa Monica Beach Restoration Pilot Project led by the Bay Foundation. We have an opportunity here to understand how coastal resilience is improved through implementing these types of nature-based projects. There are several really good examples in Southern California, and there's other examples as we move away from nature-based and into hybrid approaches, such as the Cardiff Living Shoreline Project. Nature-based adaptation strategies are largely restoring habitats to improve coastal resilience and improve our protection from things like storm impacts and sea level rise. As we move onshore here, we have offshore habitats such as kelp forests, oyster beds, and eelgrass habitats that can provide adaptation and resilience. Beaches, foredunes, and wetlands can also protect coastal infrastructure and provide resilience. And then even further back on the beach, we have back dunes and coastal bluffs. The motivation for these types of nature-based shoreline protection efforts and adaptation approaches are essentially that these habitats provide a buffer against coastal storms, erosion, and sea level rise. Many of these projects are uniquely designed, specific to the local community, and often include input from stakeholder groups, interested parties, and users of the beach. The vegetation can improve our coastal protection. The interaction between vegetation and sand accumulation, which I'll talk about quite a bit later, provides an opportunity to increase or grow dunes on beaches over time. These types of nature-based approaches, such as habitat restoration, can be much more cost-effective than hard structures and provide fewer impacts, especially to the ecology of these systems. Additionally, they provide multi-benefit approaches that I will get into a little bit more about the benefits in a moment. Some of these services and benefits that these systems provide, specifically beaches and dunes, help buffer effects from from sea level rise and storm erosion and other climate impacts. Over time, they can accrete sand and retain it on site, which helps provide a buffer against flooding. They provide recreational and educational opportunities, infrastructure protection, carbon sequestration, biodiversity. They can support rare species, help with the nutrient cycle, and many more benefits. For the remainder of my talk, I'm going to focus in on one project in particular at Santa Monica Beach. This pilot project was implemented in 2016, and we conducted an intensive 6-year study of this system. And we'll present some of the key findings today. A little bit about the background of the beach. Santa Monica Beach has been groomed intensively for over 70 years. It has a history of beach nourishment with over 17.5 million cubic yards of sand deposited between the 1930s and 1950s. At this site in particular, we were testing a cost-effective approach with minimal intervention. We had an approximate area of 3 acres, and the project had many partners. One of the things I want to emphasize in the talk today is that these types of projects can't be implemented without a collective group of partners. California State Parks owns the land. City of Santa Monica are the land managers. The Bay Foundation implemented the project with funding from U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the Annenberg Foundation, and UCSB conducted much of the research. I also want to acknowledge that this site is located on unceded Gabrielino Tongva tribal land. Some of the goals of this project, in addition to increasing coastal resilience, was to provide benefits to the ecosystem and wildlife and enhance community engagement. As a pilot project, one of the most important things was showing the Los Angeles community and visitors that a beach does not have to be mechanically raked or groomed and can provide multiple benefits. The process for implementing projects like this, and specifically the Santa Monica Beach project, begins with stakeholder engagement. This is a key component of any project type, and we performed substantial outreach, both to the surrounding residents and community and businesses, but also to different groups that have a vested interest in this site, such as surf camps, Girl Scout troops. We hosted several public meetings. And as any project, for the success of any project, an intensive baseline monitoring study was performed, and you'll see some of those data in a moment. We went through a planning design process with some beautiful artistic renderings developed that really helped the public see the opportunity for the site and what it might look like 5 to 10 years later. We received a coastal development permit through the California Coastal Commission. Now with the Green Tape initiatives, these types of projects are a little bit easier to implement and can be larger in size with less permitting. Implementation was quite short. We'll talk about that in a moment. And maintenance is ongoing. And then the entire project was intensively studied as a pilot project and the first of its kind for the region, arguably in even larger than the California region. We had a lot of opportunities to learn and implement scientific research techniques. Stakeholder engagement was also a key component of this project and others like it throughout the implementation and as part of many aspects of this process. I mentioned we implemented it in December of 2016. It was very straightforward. It had a perimeter sand fence, which you can see in this photograph down here, and a post and rope symbolic pathway going through the middle of the site. We also seeded the site with 4 native dune species and then left it alone. So the management strategies for projects like this is very cost effective, but also fairly straightforward to implement. Excuse me. And the maintenance on it was very low. We remove some sea rocket and make sure that trash doesn't accumulate. But essentially, with native vegetation seeds and a sand fence that delineated the perimeter, that was the extent of what we did. No grooming, no irrigation or anything like that. So very far on that left-hand side of the nature-based spectrum. It also provided an opportunity for scientific research to inform other pilot projects in the region. And I'll be talking about the results from a subset of these scientific monitoring components. This is a drone shot of the site. It's an oblique aerial shot by Dr. Kyle Emery. And you can see the project boundary identified around the outside in blue. And you can see within that, so it's extended a little bit outside of the project fence line so that we could get dunes forming on the other side of the fence. And you can see, well, it's mostly buried in this photo, but you can see the perimeter fence line around the edge of the project site. You can see this back area that has a lot of primrose, beach evening primrose, a rack line, coastal strand zone with some incipient vegetation hummocks over here. And notably this incipient foredune system. So it's a dune system that's forming over time. One of the things I want to mention here is the predominant wind direction. Dunes form, they're very dynamic systems, and they form over time with sand accumulation based on aeolian or wind-driven transport. This foredune system is independent of the sand fence, and I'll talk about some specific results associated with it in a moment. This is a drone video of the project site, and I apologize, it's going to be a little bit choppy from Zoom, but you can see us going over the project site, or you can see us going over the groomed beach adjacent to the project site. You can see some of the grooming tractor tracks and the raking lines. As we go over the project site, you can see the back of the system, the fence line, the incipient foredune system, and then adjacent groomed beach to the south of the site, which was our control site. So it was an area that we didn't modify, continued to have grooming, and studied as compared to the pilot project restoration area. The next couple of slides are some before and afters. This left-hand panel is about a month after implementation. So you can see some remnant driving tracks on the site, but you can see that the site is starting to accumulate some higher grains of sediment. You can see the perimeter sand fence in the background and the interpretive pathway going through the middle of the site. And the photographs on the right are approximately 6 years later, and you can see these large dune systems forming. In this shot, you can see the incipient foredune. And again, this project, this photograph on the left is about a month after implementation. And what's interesting here is you can see this initial sand accumulation already beginning adjacent to the perimeter fence line. So very early sand accumulation on site. 6 years later, you can see it's turned into this large dune system, largely covering the perimeter fence line, and you can see the foredune in the background. This shot is from the interpretive pathway facing north, and you can see about a month after the project started, largely unvegetated. We did have fast germination due to a couple of good, well-timed storm events. And then again, at approximately 6 years later, you can see a lot of vegetation forming. You can see All of this light colored sand is sand accumulation for, again, the fore dune in the background and the northern perimeter fence dune. Here are just another couple of shots from across the site. People love to walk down the interpretive pathway and read the interpretive signs. One of the things that's been really important to the successes of this project is the seeding of the native vegetation with dune ecosystem engineers. And in this photograph, you can see 3 different of those ecosystem engineers, or the plants that are well adapted to trapping sand. This patch here is red sand verbena. There's spikes of sea scale throughout the photograph, and then beach burr, large hummocks of beach burr, largely associated with the fore dune and around the perimeter fence. These plants are key to trapping wind-driven sand, retaining it within their small dune, and then growing on top of it over time. And as this process repeats, the dunes get larger. One of the things that's worth noting in this project event timeline, that you can read some of the kind of key event dates, but the thing I really want to mention is that sand accumulation started very early in the project period. By January, we had small dunes adjacent to the sand fencing. And even with less than 1% vegetation cover and about 2% by 2018, we had the fore dune begin forming. So it actually doesn't take a lot of vegetation cover to form dunes, which is really a key finding. Even approximately 6 years later, we still have a little less, or approximately 7% vegetation cover, which is not a lot if you're used to thinking about systems that have really dense vegetation. One of the things that's important to track is the volume of sand accreted over time or added to the site. The solid line shows the restoration site, and the dotted line shows the groomed control area. And you can see that based on the volume change per meter of shoreline, there was some erosion or volume decrease on the groomed control site, and really highly variable over time. And that's due largely to the mechanical raking or grooming of the site. Whereas you can see at the restoration site, we have this somewhat logarithmic growth of sand volume accretion over time, which is what we want for resilience. This is a digital elevation model that is based on a drone survey that was conducted in November of 2022. Again, approximately 6 years after the implementation of the project. And you can see around the perimeter of the site, really notable dunes associated with the perimeter fence line, as well as this fore dune system here. And really interesting results are that the entire site accumulated over 2,700 metric tons of sand. I just want to pause there for a minute. 2,700 metric tons of sand, or 1,700 cubic meters. This equates, if we break it down to analyzing the site in a cross-shore transect, about 1 meter in width, about 1.2 metric tons per meter of shoreline per year, which is really substantial, especially for a small project site. This black line outlines the fore dune system, and that alone had over 540 cubic meters of sand accumulation in 6 years, or 870 metric tons, or about 1.2 metric tons per meter of shoreline per year. The fore dune is important because it's not associated with the sand fencing, and so it looks like what the system might respond to naturally, how the site might respond naturally. Again, the predominant wind direction is this heading sort of an easterly, but the key point here is that the predominant wind direction helps drive the sand transport across the site. So it both adds to the foredunes here, creates these wind-driven dune tails behind the dunes, but it also allows for really substantial amount of sediment accumulation on the southern half of the project site and associated with the southern fence line. This is really important when designing these types of resilience projects to consider which direction the wind is blowing, how much sand transport you may have, among other factors. The vegetation cover over time, again, was quite variable. You can see the dotted line on the bottom is the groom control site, which was just zeros the whole time. So pretty easy to see the difference here. The vegetation establishment was variable, but again, in our most recent survey just this past January, still only about 7% vegetation cover, which was still enough to allow for very substantial dune formation. Another thing I want to point out is that the sand accumulation happened even when the vegetation was very low, less than 2%. These are photographs of the 6 native species we have on site, including this rare species of woolly heads. We've got beach burr, primrose, a couple of species of verbena and sea scale. And we also have one non-native on site, sea rocket, which is periodically removed, and the seed bank is depleted over time. It's removed because it's not a key dune ecosystem engineer and does not form dunes in the same way that the native species do. One of the things I want to highlight is the foredune system. So if you're just to orient you on this graph, the top 2 graphs are looking at plant zonation. So we're looking at individual species cover of different plants along a cross-shore transect with the back sand fence, the eastern part of the project site. As you move to the right-hand side of the graph, you're going closer to the ocean. And so these are essentially a transect zone broken down by meters from the back fence. So by the time you get to about 50 meters, you're hitting the intertidal area. In March of, I can't see my date. I think it's 2017 or 2018. Zoom's covering it for me. But you can already see early on into the project, this 2019, sorry. You can see even after just a couple of years of formation, you can start to see some identification of plant zonation. So in the back, we've got lots of the primrose, which is this dotted line. And in the foredune, we have more abronia, which increases over time. And you can see that the plants have, even though we seeded the site evenly across the site, we have plant zonation with the dune ecosystem engineers like red sand verbena and beach burr associated with the foredune system. The bottom graph shows some beach cross-section profiles pulled from the drone data, which identify a really substantial amount of sediment accumulation along the fence line and associated with this foredune system. These types of nature-based adaptation strategies provide many benefits for wildlife and people. One of the ones to highlight was that the site was the first site to have a western snowy plover nest in almost 70 years. To summarize some of our key results, we have enhanced resilience to sea level rise based on sand accumulation, with the greatest accretion associated with the sand fencing, in some cases the peaks being over 1.3 meters in height, and with the foredune ridge, with peaks being approximately 3/4 of a meter to 0.9 meters in height in sand accumulation and elevation increase. The formation of the foredune was associated with key interactions with some of these species. Again, the wind drives the sand onto the site, the sand trapping vegetation starts to form the dunes, and they grow on top of themselves over time. The initial sand accumulation happened within months of the project implementation, as did the vegetation germinating across the site, with the foredune ridge taking multiple years to form and still increasing in height today. Our next steps include additional monitoring and research and assessing a disturbance or multiple disturbance events to truly test whether the site is more resilient to erosion than the adjacent control areas and groomed beaches. This is my last slide, and then I'm looking forward to questions. Some of the management applications for projects to improve coastal resilience are really tied to performing vulnerability assessments and site selection, but also nature-based adaptation strategies like dune restoration require the right amount of adaptation space, including wind-driven process and enough space to grow the dunes over time. One of the things I want to highlight here is in the 6 years of the study, the sea level rise based on current California rates rose approximately 24 to 60 millimeters within this time frame, while the foredune peaks were orders of magnitude above that at about 500 to 900 millimeters, which is, so this is sort of a snapshot 6 years later, which is much faster than the rate of sea level rise. I want to emphasize optimizing partnership opportunities. Projects like this are impossible to do in a vacuum, but great when you have support and leadership from multiple entities and agencies and teams. We have an opportunity to learn from projects like this to scale them up and utilize them as models. And again, these types of strategies for coastal resilience are much more cost effective. And so if we can find the right places for them, they're great strategies to accumulate sand and buffer the effects of sea level rise and storm erosion. These types of studies can't be done in a vacuum again. So I want to thank everybody. I want to thank my co-authors of the publication we're going to link to in the chat, which a lot of the results I summarized in the slides here. So I want to thank Jenny Dugan, Dave Hubbard, Kyle Emery, and Melody Grubbs. I also want to thank Annenberg Foundation, United States Environmental Protection Agency, and Sea Grant for funding various portions of the project and research, the Bay Foundation for implementing the project, Coastal Commission for permitting, and many other partners. And that's my email. I'll also post it in the chat, and I look forward to questions. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Karina. I'm getting some comments, some messages in the chat about how cool the graphs are, how gorgeous the photos are. So thank you so much for sharing today.
Thank you.
So we'll transition now to our question and answer session. So feel free to throw your questions in the chat or to raise your hand and come off mute. And we can go in the order that they come in. To start us off, I have some questions that were submitted in registration. And so we'll start off with one of those. Karina, you talked a little bit about considering wind direction, wind speed, and location and design of living shoreline projects. Can you talk a little bit more about the criteria that go into designing and deciding the location for these projects?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, I think one of the key elements of this type of dune restoration as a nature-based adaptation approach is having enough space. And so there are other examples of projects, space and wind. Although the Santa Monica Beach site actually has lower wind than a lot of other parts of California, it was still enough to accumulate sediment. But to create sand and grow the dunes, you have to have the right, it's called fetch distance. And so it's a combination of the beach width, having enough width to be able to grow the dunes, and the wind transport distance. And one of the things that it's important to know where these types of projects will work and won't work. They would be quite challenging and less effective on very narrow beaches with low sand driven transport, and more effective on beaches where you have enough space to grow them slowly over time. I'll stop there.
Awesome, thank you. Dr. Dorsey, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Karina. Karina, can you comment on, I think we saw some interesting, the aftermath of the huge wave season that we had during this past winter and some of the erosion and everything. Can you comment a little bit on how the site withstood all that?
Yeah, absolutely. We did go out to the site after some of the intense storms in January, several that caused really substantial erosion in other parts of Southern California. And the site did great. I mean, in the short version, the wave run up within the site largely stopped at the foredune, and there was almost no erosion of the project area. Whereas at the control site, the wave run up went about 50 or 60 meters further up the beach. And so that to us showed this foredune protecting the area behind it from flooding. I think we'll need more substantial events to really test the resilience of the site to storms. It'll be interesting to see how the site does after this winter with the potential El Nino.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat from Carrie Boyle. The question is, can you tell us more about the public's reaction to this? Were they supportive during the stakeholder engagement phase? What is the general reaction now that it's implemented?
Thanks so much for the question, Carrie. Now I get to tell my favorite stakeholder story. So in one of the public meetings we hosted for the project, we invited all of the local residents, businesses, communities. We sent the invite far and wide, stakeholder groups from further inland to utilize the site to escape summer heat and things like that. And at one of the presentations, we had a woman who was interested in stopping the project. When I was speaking with her before, we gave a presentation and included these visuals and graphics. And she said, well, how do I stop it? I just like to put my towel there. That's my favorite spot. And I said, okay, we can talk about that. There's lots of opportunities in the permitting process for public feedback on various things. And but maybe just take a look around at some of these interpretive graphics and we'll give a presentation. And then halfway during the presentation, she stood up and had this a little bit of kind of an angry face. And I was terrified about what she was going to say in this big room of people who were interested in learning about the project. And she turned to City of Santa Monica and said, why isn't it bigger? And so I think sometimes you just have to, for projects like this, it can be a shock to change a flat, groomed beach that people have identified as iconic to the Los Angeles region in particular for many, many decades. But once you understand some of the benefits and potential resilience elements that it can provide, I think people are really starting to understand that as they see storm events having increasing impacts on flooding infrastructure and things like that. But I think what really sold her were the pictures of the flowers that that the site can have. And she still puts her towel there. So, but yeah, so just to answer your question, Carrie, that in general, the public was really excited about this project. I think we intentionally scaled it quite small as a pilot to gauge people's reaction. But I think one of the most important parts of the process was the really intensive stakeholder engagement in the outreach phase of the project prior to even beginning implementation or even before we started applying for permits. And so we're really happy that the reactions have been so positive. I think people like the interpretive signs. They like the pathway going through the middle. We don't have a sand fence or a perimeter around the oceanward side of the project. And so people can still feel free to enter the project site. We see a lot of people go in and take photos and things like that. But there's a little bit more protection from things like grooming.
Awesome, thank you. So going back to the previous question, we have a question from Solisha Andico at the city of Malibu, asking if you can discuss more about beach qualifications where this type of restoration will work. You stated that this is a function of the beach width and transport distance, and that this is not effective in areas of narrow beaches. Can you please elaborate?
Yeah, so actually, if you email me, Salisha, I can send you a reference that's the climate assessment for California. And there are some pretty specific guidelines in there that I think would be helpful. But in this case, our beach width was quite large, about 170 meters on average. From the ocean to the back infrastructure. You probably don't need quite that much space, but again, narrow beaches probably won't work. Santa Monica Beach in particular is in the middle of the Santa Monica Bay, and so it's a little bit more protected. So if you want, you can email me, we could talk more specifically about different sites. I think each beach is unique, but you really need the kind of sand transport and that interaction with the vegetation to accumulate the sand over time. So I know that wasn't entirely specific, but I'm happy to send you some references and talk to you about kind of site-specific locations too.
Yeah, and Karina, if you can send that to me too, then I can include that in the resources after this in a
Yeah, absolutely.
follow-up email. Great.
I also wanted to respond one more to, yeah, you're welcome, to Carrie's last question. The general reaction now that it's implemented has been extraordinarily positive. Every interaction we have with folks who are walking through the site or looking at or taking pictures, everybody's just really enthusiastic. So it's one of my favorite projects because everybody loves it. So that makes that easier.
Awesome. Okay, so feel free to keep adding your questions in the chat, but for now, I want to pull one more question in from the registration questions. You talked a little bit, Karina, about permitting and streamlining and how that maybe changed in the time since you implemented this project. Can you speak a little bit more about permitting experiences and ideas for streamlining sand replenishment or living shoreline projects?
Yeah, certainly. So because of the really low level of intervention that we had on this site, it's essentially just sand fence and some native seeds. The permits are fairly straightforward. As you scale up the approaches or get further into the kind of hybrid to structure-based approaches, you're going to have a lot more intensive costs and permitting that are associated with that. So structure-based systems, especially, you probably, in many cases, have to go through a full CEQA environmental impact report assessment, really intensive permitting through the Coastal Commission and others. For us, at this project site, we did apply for a coastal development permit. In some cases that may now be able to be waived, but we wanted to go through that public process because it was, again, this pilot project and the first time it was implemented really in the region. And so there was a lot of questions associated with it. And we wanted to make sure that we addressed those through the permitting process and had that public kind of feedback as part of the permit. So there was a coastal development permit as well as a state park scientific collecting permit because it's on state parks land. So again, this is one of those situations where each project site might be different. We've had a couple of other projects implemented on LA County beaches, and there's an access permit that you need through LA County Department of Beaches and Harbors. So depending on where your site is, each project is different. But with the Green Tape Initiative now, you can have larger projects that aren't subject to CEQA. So you can start scaling these up.
Great, that's exciting. Thank you. Okay, so we have two more questions that have just come in. First, we have a question about if you have any plans to conduct invertebrate monitoring in the project area in the future.
Yeah, that's great. I actually have a slide about that. So let me go ahead and share my screen again. Thanks for asking that, Bobby. So we did conduct invertebrate monitoring. This graph shows the results of the intertidal invertebrate monitoring, largely Megalorchestia or amphipods that live in the intertidal zone adjacent to the project site. And what we found over a series of survey events is that there really wasn't a substantial difference for intertidal invertebrates, except for there's a couple of instances where the restoration site, which is the lighter gray, was a little bit higher than the groom control site. But there's a few reasons for this. One is that the site is quite small and surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of meters of groom beach. We have a little bit of an island effect. And so this is a scenario where if you build it, they might not come, or it might take more time. And so we have also the rack input to the system, or the kelp that washes ashore is fairly low, and there's efforts made to not groom the high tide line in other areas, which might also account for the lack of a difference in intertidal invertebrates. What we do see on site is dune beetles and other terrestrial species, lots of pollinators that are associated with the site. And so the terrestrial species have responded, whereas the beach hoppers have not. I hope that addresses some of your question.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, another question about adaptive management. So Sean Anderson mentions that there are they have some substantial dune systems in near urbanized shorelines, and is wondering how you manage things like unhoused populations and how they interact with the site and other challenges, you know, when you're working in these urban coastlines more generally. I kind of rephrased your question, Sean, so if I missed something, feel free to throw it in the chat. But
yeah, hi Sean, thanks. Yeah, so there are unhoused folks that frequent and reside on Santa Monica Beach. In some cases, they're adjacent to lifeguard towers. I think since COVID, this challenge has increased over time. We don't have a direct connection to the management of those people, whereas the city of Santa Monica addresses some of those challenges and issues. I think there are people that do like to live in dunes, and so larger systems, as we implement and scale up these types of projects, larger systems would probably have to have some sort of adaptation plan and management plan associated with folks trying to reside there. So I know that's a little bit of a vague answer, but we don't directly manage those people, but I do think that it can be a challenge that needs to be overcome. I think there's another couple of examples I can think of large dune systems that have a lot of those challenges. So I think it's important it's one of those important considerations from a site-specific perspective too. So as we scale up, we can start actually talking about what that management might look like.
great, thank you. So I think those are all the questions we have for now. If there are more questions, Karina generously shared her email in the chat. I'll include it in the post email or the post webinar follow-up email as well, in addition to her presentation slides, the recording of this, and some of the links that were shared and mentioned.
Sorry, can I answer one more question that wasn't asked?
Yes.
Only because it came in the feedback from the surveys about trash. And so one of the initial concerns of implementing this project was that trash would accumulate within the restoration project site. based on our surveys, there's no significant difference between the restoration site and the control site, which is the groomed beach that's heavily maintained. And I think part of that is due to, well, I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but interestingly, not a substantial issue. In some cases, there's a little bit of litter or some chip bags that blow in, and it's fairly easy to maintain. But we have found, again, the same trash in the control site areas too. So that was one of the challenges that was raised in the outreach process, but didn't really come out as an issue at the end. Sorry, I know that wasn't asked, but I just wanted to answer it anyway.
Thanks for bringing it up. And I'll say that if you look at the paper that we linked, there's a really good figure in there that illustrates some of what Karina's talking about in terms of trash. So, great. Well, I want to wrap up the presentation with just, first of all, a thank you to Karina again for being here today, but also highlighting some of the opportunities for implementing this. So sometimes we talk about strategies, and then the next question is, well, how do we do it? Where do we get funding? So I want to highlight some recent funding opportunities that have come online. First, I'll highlight the Coastal Quest funding database, and I'll include all these links in the chat. There you can find actually the other two opportunities that are listed below that. And I've included the direct link to the database in the chat, in addition to just the Coastal Quest webpage. Now, talking about specific opportunities, there were two opportunities recently announced. First, the OPR ICARP Regional Resilience Grants. Those are state level funding, and that is specifically funding regional climate resilience efforts, including identifying climate resilience priorities, building capacity, and implementing projects that respond to a region's greatest climate risks. So that's opportunity number one. The second one I want to highlight, second big one, is the NOAA Climate Resilience Regional Challenge. And Abira, if you go to the next slide, I wanted to just highlight this one a bit more in case folks aren't aware of it. So NOAA recently announced that $575 million is available from the Inflation Reduction Act for building resilience of coastal communities to impacts of climate change. And that can include things like sea level rise, but it can also include things like drought. Now, the two separate tracks that are available to be funded are one, collaborative building, and two, implementation of projects. So depending where you are in your adaptation planning, you might find that you fit closer into one track or another. And notably, there's no matching requirement for this funding opportunity. There's a good bit of time before the letter of intent is due, which is in August. And before then, there are a few virtual information sessions taking place throughout July. So I just included a link to that as well in the chat, and you can sign up for the webinars or the information sessions. But we also invite you to reach out to USCC Grant if you are interested in any of these opportunities and exploring a partnership for your adaptation idea. That is the last of what I have. Abira, next slide, please. So I want to thank you all again for joining us today. Thank Karina again for that excellent presentation. Like I said, the recording, Karina's presentation, all of these links will be compiled and shared via email. And I encourage you, if you're not signed up already, to check out the AdaptLA page and sign up for our mailing list if you're not yet. Again, if you have any questions, ideas, future AdaptLA topics, adaptation project, reach out at any time to myself or to Phyllis, and we'd be happy to chat. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you all for attending.